April 12, 1945. The air over the Thuringian Basin is heavy with the scent of wet ash and the metallic tang of spent artillery shells. A persistent bone-chilling drizzle falls upon the jagged remains of a village that, only weeks prior, had been a bastion of the Thousand-Year Reich. Now, the cobblestones are slick with a mixture of spring rain and the black, oily soot that rises from every cellar window. There is a profound, unnatural silence that follows the roar of the American Sherman tanks, a silence filled by the rhythmic dripping of water from shattered eaves and the distant low rumble of a dying war moving further east. The civilians who emerge from the shadows of their basements are apparitions of a former life. Their skin is gray, layered with the cumulative grime of 6 years of total war. For the people of this town, the war has not just been a sequence of maps and battles, it has been a slow, grinding descent into filth. The Third Reich, which promised a gleaming future of racial purity and modern efficiency, has instead delivered a reality where even the most basic human dignity has been stripped away. They stand in the mud, clutching threadbare coats, their faces masks of exhaustion and profound uncertainty. This moment in April 1945 represents the intersection of two worlds. Behind the German civilians lay years of ersatz existence. The chemical industry that had once been the envy of the world had been diverted entirely to the production of explosives and synthetic fuels. For the average housewife or the retreating soldier, this meant the disappearance of genuine soap. In its place was Resaer Friedensief, a gritty, clay-like brick that did not lather, did not clean, and often left the skin raw and irritated. It was a physical manifestation of a regime that had prioritized the mechanics of death over the hygiene of life. To look upon these people is to see the physical toll of an ideology that eventually consumed its own creators. The dirt on their hands and the grease in their hair are not merely signs of poverty. They are the stains of a collapsing social order. They had been told for years that the Americans were a soft, decadent people, a mongrel nation of jazz and excess that would crumble before the iron will of the German spirit. They expected a vengeful, disorganized mob of looters. Instead, they watched as a disciplined, seemingly infinite machine of steel and rubber rolled through their streets with a terrifying, quiet efficiency. As the last echoes of the Tiger tanks faded, replaced by the high-pitched whine of Jeep engines, the civilians watched from behind boarded-up windows and piles of rubble. They looked for the signs of the barbarians they had been promised. They saw men in olive drab who looked well-fed, their uniforms sturdy, their boots thick with tread. More importantly, they saw a level of logistics that defied their understanding of what a military could be. Among the crates of ammunition and the drums of fuel, there were other boxes, smaller, lighter, and marked with symbols that had nothing to do with the business of killing. Within those wooden slats lay a weapon of psychological warfare more potent than any shell, the promise of a return to civilization. The architecture of deprivation in 1945 Germany was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing erosion of the domestic sphere. By the time the Allied armies crossed the Rhine, the German civilian population had been living in a state of biological and material siege for over half a decade. The shortages were absolute. The Third Reich's war machine was a hungry god, demanding every gram of fat, every drop of oil, and every scrap of metal for the front lines. What remained for the civilian was a shadow world of substitutes. Leather was replaced by pressed cardboard, coffee was roasted acorns, and soap, the very bedrock of public health, had become a rare, precious artifact of a vanished era. In the early years of the conflict, the plunder of occupied Europe had briefly shielded the German housewife from the realities of total war. Trains filled with French butter, Dutch cheeses, and luxury soaps from the Mediterranean had created an illusion of sustainable conquest. But as the tide turned at Stalingrad and the Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified, the supply lines withered. The German chemical giant, IG Farben, had once promised a future of synthetic plenty, but as the Allied blockade tightened, their laboratories were redirected. Every available lipid and fat was prioritized for high-grade lubricants for Luftwaffe engines or the production of nitrocellulose for explosives. By late 1944, the standard soap ration for a German civilian had reached a point of absurdity. The official product, often stamped with the letters RIF, stood for Reichsstelle für industrielle Fettversorgung, Reich Office for Industrial Fat Supply, though a grim urban legend suggested it stood for rein jüdisches Fett, pure Jewish fat. In reality, it was a wretched concoction of sodium carbonate, clay, and fine sand. It possessed no fatty acids. It did not emulsify oils or lift the deep-seated grime from a laborer's hands. To use it was to endure a gritty, abrasive ritual that left the skin dry, cracked, and still fundamentally unclean. This lack of hygiene was more than a physical discomfort, it was a psychological weight. In a society that had been obsessed with the aesthetics of order and cleanliness, the inability to wash away the smell of smoke and the dust of rubble was a constant reminder of failure. The crumbling of the plumbing systems under the weight of 1,000 bomber raids meant that water was carried in buckets from communal taps, and heating it was a luxury few could afford. A person's social standing in these final months was often measured by the darkness of the ring around their collar or the greasiness of their hair. When the American infantry arrived, they did not just find a defeated military. They found a population that felt physically degraded. The German people had been conditioned to believe that their Kultur was the pinnacle of civilization, yet they found themselves living like scavengers in the ruins of their own making. They were a people who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly clean. The deprivation had reached into the very pores of their skin, creating a desperate, unspoken longing for the simple, mundane miracle of a hot bath and a bar of real soap, a longing that the American logistical tale was about to answer in a way that no propaganda broadcast could ever counter. The shadow of the propaganda was a thick, suffocating veil that had colored every German perception of the advancing Western Allies. For a decade, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had painted a vivid, terrifying portrait of the American soldier. He was depicted as a mindless cog in a soulless capitalist machine, a gangster from the slums of Chicago or a primitive, uncultured brute from the frontier. The German civilian, huddled in their cellar, did not expect a liberator. They expected a barbarian who would revel in the destruction of European high culture. They had been told that the Americans were a people without history, without morals, and, most crucially, without mercy. This orchestrated fear served a dual purpose. It stiffened the resolve of the remaining Wehrmacht units and kept the civilian population in a state of terrified compliance. The stories circulated in the local party broadsheets spoke of systematic looting, the desecration of churches, and the cold-blooded execution of those who dared to surrender. To the average resident of a small Thuringian town, the rumble of American armor was the sound of an impending apocalypse. They anticipated the arrival of men who would treat them with the same ruthless disregard that the Reich had shown its own victims in the East. The emotional contrast, however, began at the very moment of contact. As the first GIs stepped off their transports, the civilians saw men who were not the starving, desperate wraiths of Goebbels' imagination. Instead, they encountered soldiers who appeared almost impossibly youthful and healthy. These were men who possessed an aura of casual confidence, a sharp contrast to the rigid, fear-driven discipline of the German ranks. They did not move like conquerors seeking vengeance. They moved like workmen finishing a difficult job. The sight of a soldier leaning against a mud-caked fender, nonchalantly unwrapping a chocolate bar or sharing a cigarette, was a jarring subversion of every wartime broadcast. The shock was visceral. Where the civilians expected the lash or the bayonet, they found a strange, detached benevolence. The Americans seemed less interested in political retribution than in the mundane details of occupation. They were fascinated by the local architecture, curious about the surviving livestock, and, most surprisingly, generous with their supplies. The gangster was nowhere to be found. In his place was a young man from Iowa or New York who seemed to have more in common with their own lost sons than the demons of the radio programs. This realization created a profound psychological rift. If the state had lied about the character of the enemy, what else had been a fabrication? The German civilian began to look at their own ragged, unwashed reflection and then at the clean-shaven, well-equipped American. The disparity was not just in military power, but in the very quality of existence. The propaganda had promised that the struggle was for the survival of civilization, yet here stood the barbarian, offering a level of material and human decency that the Reich had failed to provide even in its height. The fear did not vanish instantly, but it began to be replaced by a burgeoning, desperate curiosity about the world these men brought with them in their heavy olive-green trucks. The arrival of the convoy in the town square was an exercise in industrial choreography. It was a spectacle that the German civilians watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation from their doorsteps. The massive deuce-and-a-half trucks, their tires churning the April mud into deep ruts, did not stop to deploy troops for combat. Instead, they reversed with the piercing, rhythmic chirping of their engines, positioning their tailboards toward the shivering crowds. The soldiers who leapt down did not carry their rifles at the ready. They slung them casually over their shoulders, their attention focused on the heavy wooden crates stacked high in the truck beds. To a population that had seen their own logistical tail reduced to horse-drawn carts and scavenged bicycles, the sheer mechanical power on display was a revelation of American might. There was an agonizing tension in the air as the first pry bars screeched against the wood. The townspeople, many of whom had not seen a fresh piece of fruit or a clean garment in years, expected the contents to be military hardware, perhaps parts for a field hospital or communication wire. When the lids were finally tossed aside, the sight that greeted them was entirely alien to the experience of a besieged nation. There were no olive-drab canisters of gas or jagged belts of machine-gun ammunition. Instead, the crates were filled with neatly packed, brightly colored boxes that gave off a scent so sharp and clean it seemed to cut through the lingering stench of the town's burning outskirts. The initial confusion was palpable. A young corporal, his face smeared with the grease of the motor pool, reached into a crate and held up a small, rectangular object wrapped in ivory-colored paper. He signaled to a middle-aged woman standing at the front of the crowd, a woman whose hands were stained black from the charcoal she had been burning for warmth. With a casual toss, he threw the object toward her. She caught it with the reflexive desperation of the hungry, expecting a ration of hardtack or perhaps a tin of salted meat. When she looked down, her eyes widened. It was not food, yet it represented a luxury that had been extinct in the Reich for a generation. The word "Seif" rippled through the crowd in a hushed, incredulous whisper. It was a sound of recognition mingled with profound shock. The distribution was not a chaotic scramble. It was a methodical, almost nonchalant demonstration of surplus. The soldiers handed out the bars with the same indifference one might show when passing out flyers. They did not ask for identification. They did not demand a ration coupon. To the American GIs, this was merely a routine task of civil affairs, a small part of the massive Operation Cleanliness intended to curb the spread of typhus and skin diseases. But to the Germans, it was the first tangible evidence that the world they had known, a world defined by scarcity and the ersatz substitute, was being replaced by a superpower that could afford to give away its cleanliness. As the distribution continued, the atmosphere in the square began to shift. The rigid fear that had gripped the town since the first artillery shells fell began to soften into a wary, stunned gratitude. The civilians stood in line, their eyes fixed on the trucks, watching as crate after crate was emptied. The American abundance was not just a statistic in a report or a claim on a radio broadcast. It was a physical weight in their palms. In that mud-streaked square, the realization began to take hold. The war was not just being won by better tanks or more planes, but by a society that possessed so much that it could treat a bar of soap as a standard-issue weapon of peace. The fragrance of abundance was a sensory assault that bypassed the intellect and struck directly at the memory. As the paper wrappings were torn away in the damp April air, the scent that radiated from the crates was almost overwhelming. It was the smell of lavender, of pressed oils, and of a clean, industrial floral sweetness that had no equivalent in the wartime German lexicon. 4 years, the olfactory landscape of the Reich had been defined by the sour stench of unwashed bodies, the acrid bite of coal smoke, and the stale, earthy odor of the ersatz clay bricks. To inhale the aroma of a fresh bar of American soap was to be transported, instantly and violently, back to a world that existed before the sirens, before the rationing, and before the darkness of total war. This bar of soap was more than a cleaning agent. It was a recurring symbolic object of American democracy. It represented a society that had mastered the transition from the laboratory to the assembly line without sacrificing the well-being of its people. Unlike the German RIF soap, which felt like a piece of pumice stone designed to punish the flesh, the American bar was smooth, creamy, and substantial. It was carved with clean, bold lettering, Lifebuoy, Palmolive, Ivory, names that meant nothing to the German civilians but suggested a world of choices, a world where even the most basic necessity was an object of quality. It was a tangible piece of the American dream, handed over in a mud-caked square in the heart of a broken Europe. The physical sensation of the soap was a revelation. When the civilians returned to their homes, carrying their prizes like religious relics, the simple act of washing became a profound emotional experience. For the first time in years, they watched as water transformed into a rich, white lather that didn't just move the dirt around but lifted it away. The foam was thick and luxurious, a stark contrast to the thin, gray scum produced by the state-mandated substitutes. As they scrubbed their skin, the water in the basins turned black, shedding the literal and figurative layers of the war. The grit of the air raids, the grease of the factory, and the film of the bunkers were rinsed away, leaving behind a fragrance that lingered in the rooms long after the water had been emptied. This was the scent of a superpower. It was the smell of a nation that could mobilize millions of men, build thousands of ships, and still ensure that every soldier had a surplus of toiletries to give away to a defeated enemy. The German people had been told that the American economy was a fragile house of cards, built on debt and decadence. Yet, the evidence in their wash basins told a different story. The soap was an ambassador of a different ideology, one that didn't demand sacrifice for the sake of a grand, abstract destiny, but instead provided comfort as a byproduct of its own overwhelming productivity. The fragrance did more than mask the smell of defeat. It suggested that the victors possessed a secret that the Reich had never understood. In the quiet of their homes, as the lavender and pine scents settled into the floorboards, the civilians felt a strange, unsettling shift in their perception. The soap was a tiny, rectangular weapon that had breached their psychological defenses. It was impossible to maintain a total hatred for a people who brought such cleanliness and light into a world of soot and ash. The American abundance was not just reflected in the tanks on the street or the planes in the sky. It was present in the palm of a child's hand, in the lather on a mother's face, and in the sudden, sharp realization that the barbarians from across the sea had brought with them the very essence of civilization. The distribution of these bars was not merely a gesture of goodwill. It was a massive logistical undertaking supported by factual records of the civil affairs and military government units. As the trucks moved from town to town, the Americans were not just handing out toiletries. They were executing a calculated policy of public health and psychological stabilization. In the spring of 1945, the threat of typhus and other louse-borne diseases was a genuine concern for the Allied High Command as they moved through the squalor of a collapsed nation. To combat this, the Quartermaster Corps had mobilized tons of hygiene supplies, ensuring that behind every advancing infantry division followed a trail of soap, DDT, and clean water. The documented reactions of the German civilians were a mixture of profound shock and quiet disbelief. Many women, who had spent years boiling rags in a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of a household, were recorded as being moved to tears by the weight of a single 4-ounce bar of ivory-colored soap. There was no precedent in their recent experience for such a casual bestowal of value. In the collapsed economy of the late Reich, a bar of real soap had become a high-value black market commodity, often traded for jewelry or family heirlooms. Seeing it handed out freely to the enemy population was a subversion of every law of scarcity they had come to live by. The scale of American production was a form of historical evidence in itself. While the German industrial base was being pulverized by the 8th Air Force, American factories like those of Procter & Gamble were operating at a peak of unprecedented efficiency. They were producing millions of bars of soap monthly, not just for the home front, but specifically for overseas military use. This capacity to maintain civilian standards of comfort within a global war was a testament to the industrial depth of a democratic society. The sheer volume of these distributions, often involving hundreds of crates for a single medium-sized village, provided a data point that no German citizen could ignore. The Allies possessed an inventory of life that far exceeded the Reich's inventory of destruction. Quotes from the soldiers involved in these distributions reflected a sense of detached amusement at the civilians' reactions. Many GIs noted in their letters home that the Germans seemed more interested in the soap than in the bread or the chocolate. To the soldiers, these were merely complimentary items, but to the recipients, they were miracles of chemistry and commerce. This interaction between the well-supplied American boy and the destitute German mother created a bridge of common humanity. The soap was not just an object, it was a medium of communication that bypassed the barriers of language and ideology, speaking of a world where human needs were met with a surplus that was as effortless as it was overwhelming. This methodical distribution served as a silent indictment of the regime that had just fallen. As the civilians stood in those long, orderly lines, clutching their allocated bars, they were forced to confront a reality that their leaders had obscured. The decadent West was not just winning the battle of arms, it was winning the battle of the basin. Every bar of soap distributed was a piece of historical evidence that the American way of life was built on a foundation of material success that the master race could not hope to emulate. The cleanliness of the occupier was becoming the most visible proof of the failure of the occupied. The cleansing of ideology occurred not through grand orations or political re-education camps, but in the quiet steam of 1,000 kitchen basins. As the German civilians scrubbed their skin with the American bars, the rigid psychological armor of National Socialism began to dissolve along with the surface grime. For over a decade, the populace had been indoctrinated with the belief that their survival depended upon a Spartan, martial existence where personal comfort was a betrayal of the national cause. To be clean, in the eyes of the Reich's later years, was almost a luxury reserved for the elite or the delusional. Yet, here were the Americans, the supposedly decadent, racially inferior mongrels, proving that their strength was derived not from deprivation, but from an effortless, overwhelming surplus. This transformation was profound. It was one thing to be defeated by superior numbers of tanks or a relentless air campaign. It was quite another to be conquered by the superior quality of a common household item. The soap acted as a chemical agent that stripped away the veneer of the master race myth. As the civilians looked at their own clean hands, hands that had been stained by the labor of a war they were losing, they had to confront a devastating reality. The regime had demanded their total devotion, their sons, and their sanity, and in return, it had left them in a state of primitive filth. The enemy, conversely, appeared to possess such a mastery over the material world that they could weaponize hygiene itself. The symbolic weight of the soap began to reshape the German perception of the future. The ideology of the past had focused on the blood and soil, a dark, mystical connection to a tortured earth. The Americans brought a different gospel, the gospel of the fresh and new. Their arrival signaled an end to the era of the dark bunker and the soot-covered ruin. By providing the means to be clean, the occupiers were offering a path back into the community of civilized nations. It was a subtle, yet irresistible, invitation to trade the grim certainties of totalitarianism for the bright, scented possibilities of a democratic consumer society. Observers noted a change in the posture of the townspeople. The slumped shoulders of the defeated began to straighten as the physical sensation of cleanliness restored a long-forgotten sense of self-respect. In the eyes of a mother who could finally wash her child's face without the abrasive scratch of sand-filled ersatz soap, the American soldier ceased to be a terrifying phantom of propaganda. He became, instead, a harbinger of a world where life was not merely about survival, but about the dignity of the individual. The cleansing was not just physical. It was a washing away of the suspicion and hatred that had been carefully cultivated for years. Ultimately, the soap served as a bridge between two vastly different moral universes. The National Socialist ideology had required the dehumanization of the other to sustain itself. The American distribution of soap did the exact opposite. It rehumanized the conquered. By treating the hygiene of the German civilian as a matter of importance, the Allied forces demonstrated a value system that prioritized the individual over the state. In the simple lather of a bar of soap, the German people found the first tangible evidence that freedom did not look like chaos. It looked like a clean shirt, a fresh scent, and the quiet return of a dignity they had thought was lost forever in the fires of the war. The logistics of liberty were not merely a triumph of transport, but a profound demonstration of the industrial philosophy that separated the new world from the old. While the German High Command had spent years obsessing over the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons like the V-2 rocket or the jet-powered Me-262, the Americans had perfected the miracle of the supply chain. This was a military that viewed the well-being of the individual, even the conquered individual, as a primary objective. The sight of massive convoys carrying soap, toothbrushes, and razors alongside artillery shells was a crushing blow to the German belief in their own technical superiority. It revealed a superpower that did not have to choose between guns and butter. It was a nation so vastly productive that it could provide both in quantities that seemed almost supernatural to a starving, depleted Europe. The American way of war was fundamentally an extension of its domestic assembly lines. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati, the machinery of capitalism had been turned toward a singular goal, the saturation of the battlefield with every conceivable necessity. This logistical reach extended from the deep water ports of the Atlantic across the shattered rail lines of France and directly into the hands of a German housewife in a remote mountain village. To the Germans, who were used to a military that requisitioned their livestock and drained their local economies, the arrival of an army that brought its own abundance was a shocking reversal of the historical norm of occupation. The Americans were not there to take. They were there to overwhelm with the sheer weight of their industrial output. This abundance served as a living advertisement for the democratic model. Every crate of soap was a product of a society that prioritized the consumer, even when that consumer was wearing a uniform. The standardized quality of the goods, the uniform size, the consistent lather, the reliable packaging, spoke of a world where quality was not a luxury for the few, but a standard for the many. In contrast, the German experience of the war had been one of ersatz everything. Fake coffee, fake leather, and the dreaded fake soap. The American logistics of liberty proved that a free society could outproduce a totalitarian one not just in the quantity of its steel, but in the quality of its daily life. The German people were forced to realize that they had been outthought and outmanufactured by a system they had been taught to despise as chaotic and weak. As the distribution points became permanent fixtures in the occupied zones, the logistical scale only grew. The Quartermaster Corps managed the flow of supplies with a precision that turned hygiene into a strategic asset. By ensuring the civilian population was clean and healthy, the Americans were stabilizing their rear areas and preventing the outbreaks of disease that typically follow the collapse of a civilization. This was a pragmatic, yet profoundly human, approach to conquest. The soap was the spearhead of this stabilization. It was the most visible sign that the American occupation was not interested in the medieval spoils of war, but in the modern reconstruction of a functional society. The German civilians, standing in the shadow of the great green trucks, began to understand that the war had been decided long before the first tanks crossed the border. It had been decided in the factories and laboratories where the logistics of liberty were forged. The American ability to distribute soap to millions of defeated enemies was the ultimate proof of a power that had no limits. It was an abundance that did not just provide for the body, but signaled the end of the era of scarcity and the beginning of a new world order, one defined by the effortless, cascading flow of goods that brought with them the promise of a life no longer dictated by the grim demands of the state. The transformation of the town spirit was visible in the way the light began to catch the faces of those who had once lived in the permanent twilight of the ruins. Cleanliness was not merely a physical state, it was a psychological restoration. As the layers of carbon, grease, and the gray dust of pulverized brick were washed away, the individual features of the townspeople re-emerged from the collective mask of the defeated. The hollow-cheeked, soot-stained specters who had first approached the American trucks were replaced by men and women who looked, for the first time in years, like the people they had been before the war consumed them. This restoration of the surface was the first step in the restoration of the soul, a silent signal that the period of being a resource for a total state had ended, and the era of being a person had begun. This shift manifested in a sudden, urgent desire to reclaim the domestic sphere. Women who had received the ivory bars did not just wash themselves. They took the lather to their threadbare curtains, their remaining linens, and the floors of their scarred apartments. The scent of the soap, that sharp, floral American fragrance, became the scent of a new beginning. It acted as a disinfectant against the lingering gloom of the Nazi era. To scrub a doorstep with real suds was an act of defiance against the chaos of the previous years. It was a statement of intent, that life would return to a state of order, not through the iron decrees of a Gauleiter, but through the quiet, personal pride of a maintained home. The communal we of the propaganda-driven masses was dissolving, replaced by the I of the individual who could once again look in a mirror and see a clean face. Observers noted a change in the social fabric of the occupied zones. The irritability and desperation that define a people living in filth began to subside. When everyone is equally dirty, a society feels discarded. When everyone is clean, a sense of mutual respect returns. The American soap had provided a common baseline of dignity. In the queues for water or the makeshift markets, the civilians no longer avoided eye contact. The physical barrier of the war grime had been breached. By restoring the ability to be clean, the Allied forces had removed one of the most potent psychological effects of defeat, the feeling of being subhuman. The German civilian was no longer a rat in a cellar, as the late-war broadcasts had sometimes suggested, but a citizen of a world that valued hygiene and health. This transition from dirt to dignity was the most successful element of the American occupation's early phase. It proved that the most effective way to denazify a population was not through lectures, but through the provision of the means to live a decent life. The soap was the catalyst for this realization. It was a simple, mundane object that carried a profound message. The victors did not wish for the Germans to wallow in their ruin. They wished for them to wash, to stand up, and to join a modern world where such things were a birthright. The transformation was written in the clear eyes and the scrubbed hands of the children who played in the shadows of the Shermans, no longer smelling of the bunker, but of the fresh, clean promise of a future they were only beginning to understand. The epilogue of the bar concludes not with the fading of a scent, but with the permanence of a memory that reshaped the German identity. Decades after the last deuce-and-a-half truck rattled out of the town square, the elderly survivors of that spring would still speak of the fragrance of American soap as the literal smell of liberation. It remained a sensory anchor, a reminder of the moment when the world stopped being gray and started to regain its color. The soap was never just a tool for hygiene. It was a physical manifestation of a larger truth about the nature of freedom. It taught a defeated people that true power does not reside in the ability to demand sacrifice, but in the capacity to provide for the smallest, most intimate needs of a human being. This small, rectangular object became the silent epitaph of the Third Reich's ideology of scarcity. While the Nazi regime had offered a vision of greatness built upon the bones of the inferior, the American distribution offered a vision of greatness built upon the abundance of the ordinary. The contrast was absolute and irreversible. The bar of soap was the first chapter in the story of the post-war miracle, a precursor to the Marshall Plan and the economic rebirth of a continent. It proved that the most durable peace is not signed with ink on parchment, but is instead built through thousands of small acts of mercy and the effortless sharing of a superior way of life. In the grand tapestry of the Second World War, the distribution of soap might seem a minor footnote compared to the fall of Berlin or the liberation of the camps. Yet, for the millions of civilians who lived through the transition from occupation to reconstruction, it was the defining interaction. It was the moment they realized that the enemy was not a destroyer, but a provider. The scent of lavender and pine that drifted through the ruins of 1945 was the herald of a new world order, one where the measure of a nation was not found in the range of its missiles, but in the cleanliness of its children and the dignity of its poorest citizens. Ultimately, the soap was a messenger of democracy. It carried with it the unspoken promise that a society governed by the people, for the people, would always produce a world of greater light and less shadow. It was a weapon of peace that left no scars, only the soft, lingering fragrance of a civilization that had found a way to conquer the dirt of the past. As the final bars were used and the wrappings discarded, the ideology they carried remained. The German people had been washed clean of the old delusions, left with the realization that freedom is not a grand, abstract destiny, but a quiet, daily reality, found in the simple, mundane, and beautiful ability to start each day fresh, clean, and entirely one's own.